Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
Look at some of the top performers and say, what is it they're doing really well? Hey, is that something I could do? What you might find out, Will, is that over time, when you start developing these new skills, it wasn't that you really didn't enjoy it, is that you didn't enjoy it because you weren't that good at it. So once you become more proficient, you may actually say, hey, this type of selling is more enjoyable than I thought because genuinely people like things they're good at.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's show. On today's episode, we have Norman Behar, and we're talking about what great salespeople have in common, what personality traits they have innately, what they can learn from mentors and modeling other great salespeople, and a whole lot more. You can find out more about Norman over at salesreadinessgroup.com. He's got a new book out called The High Impact Sales Manager, and I know a lot of sales management listen to this show, even though most of our content's for sales professionals, so that's well worth a download or a purchase on Amazon. All the links are available in the show notes over at salesman.red. And so with all that said, let's jump into today's episode. Hey Norman, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You are more than welcome. I'm excited to speak to you today. I'm excited to dive into perhaps the traits that we think great salespeople have, and then we'll, I no doubt, dive into some of the, we'll start with that, some of the stereotypes that perhaps aren't what great salespeople need, but perhaps what they aspire to have in a weird, paradoxical way. And I've always thought that the best way to improve in sales, in sport, in relationships, whatever it is to find someone who is crushing it, someone that you look up to, and just try and emulate what they do. So I think the first place to start is by narrowing down these traits so that the audience and I can find these people that we look up to and suss out what really works and what really moves the needle. Where I want to start with all this is, are the best salespeople, do they live up to this stereotype of being extroverts, or is that purely in the name a stereotype?
I think it's a stereotype, but certainly being an extrovert helps. I mean, I think someone who has really good communication skills, genuinely wants to interact with other people, is going to come across sales conversations more authentically and more naturally. But they don't have to have this huge personality. I think there's a lot of very quiet, thoughtful salespeople who have really good skills. I mean, at the heart of sales is a great conversation. Before you and I went online today, we talked about just keeping this conversational, and I think that's what clients really want. And I think the key to a great conversation is being able to ask insightful questions and really listen. And I think that one of the issues a lot of salespeople have is they spend too much time talking and presenting their need, what they have, as opposed to really understanding the customer's needs and focusing on how they can create value and develop rapport. So again, being an extrovert, I think, is a asset, but I don't think it's an essential element of being a great salesperson.
And to go deeper than that on this point, is there a trend of the A players? Are they generally extroverts? Because that does help. And of course, coming from that position where you have the natural traits of perhaps sales, you're in a better position, so you're going to be more successful, perhaps. Is there a trend for the A players to be extroverts, or is it just all over the place?
I actually think the trend may be working a little bit against extroverts. I think extroverts are naturally great salespeople, and in certain business to consumer sales, being an extrovert, if you think about car sales or condominium sales or timeshares, those are industries where an extrovert personality will help a lot. But I think if you're in like B2B software sales, medical device sales, or more complex sales, it's really the people who can create the most value are going to be the highest valued by their customers, because ultimately, in a more complex, sophisticated sale, it's about how much value you can create for the customer. And that really gets to being very thoughtful and understanding their needs. So I think in certain industries, being an extrovert is essential. But in other industries, it's really about the quality of the sales conversation, the insights you provide, and the value you create. So I'm not sure that there's a trend working towards being an extrovert. In fact, in B2B, I'd say probably less of a trend.
And are there any trends then, to stick on this value side of things for a second? Excuse me. Is there any traits that lead a salesperson to be naturally better at, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes here for everyone listening, adding value? Clearly, being able to have a good conversation is one. Are there any others that naturally form that allow people to add more value from that perspective as well?
Absolutely. I think one of them is being authentic. So I think to create value, you have to be authentic. And part of being authentic is also that you develop a rapport and maybe more importantly, you develop a trusted relationship. So if you can develop trust, then you're going to be able to create value. If it comes across as not being trustworthy or not being authentic, and you're just kind of, they can tell you're just going through the motions and you've done this three other times during the day. So I think it's being authentic and having a genuine interest in being a learner and really understanding and wanting to help customers solve problems. So I do think we're finding that selling is becoming more cerebral today. Not that you shouldn't use your natural instincts, but I think there's a level of applied intelligence and applied interest that is more essential when you're looking to create value.
And just because they're new terms for me, and I think I could define them if put on the spot. But what do you mean by implied intelligence and implied interest?
Oh, if I said implied, I meant to say applied. In other words, you have to be able to apply intelligence by listening to what your customers' needs are and then saying, okay, how does what we offer align with what their needs are? So you have to be able to think about what their real problem is and then say, based on what they've shared with me, their problem is, I either need to go deeper to understand it more, or if I truly have verified that I understand their problem, I then need to think about what is it that we can do and how do we take the products and services we offer and apply that to their problem.
I'm really enjoying this. So, because my background is medical device sales, and this is exactly what I had to do. It wasn't just selling a endoscope, it was fitting out a theatre, improving their service flow and things of that nature. That's what, as soon as you got higher than perhaps just the conversation with the surgeons, that's what the C-suite wanted to know and discuss and talk about. And that was what really interested me, the almost project manager side of things. Are some people, and again, going back to these natural traits of highly successful salespeople, are some people just naturally better at putting together and managing a project like that, or is that a learned skill?
I think I think some people are naturally better. But it is a learned skill because I think, our business is skills training. And so we do believe that skills are a differentiator. And the key skills I think are important are really the ability to use questioning to identify customers' needs, to use active listening skills, and then to present solutions that are relevant. And certainly, if you're looking to hire new salespeople, you might look at some of the attributes of your top performers. And in the type of industry you came from, like medical device sales, then that would be very appropriate. But I also think that we shouldn't just assume that the traits that make you successful in one industry will make you successful in another. If you're in a very transactional business, other skills like prospecting may be much more important. So I think the skills and the attributes you look for will depend on the nature of the sales, who you're selling to, the sales cycle, and the level of complexity.
And for the individual B2B salesperson listening to this now and going, well, yeah, I kind of resonate with what you're saying, Will. I'm probably better at this project management side of things and this long-term complex sale. Yet I'm stuck in a job selling X widgets, whether it's B2C, B2B, whatever it is. How much of the success is down to being in the right job that suits them versus their ability to adapt to the role that they're in?
I think it's always better to be in a position that you want to be in. I think that salespeople are genuinely passionate. In most sales organizations, there are going to be more losses than wins. I don't know of too many organizations where the win rate is higher than the loss rate. So if you're not pretty passionate about what you do and resilient and able to come back, I think that, in a strong job market, I would actively suggest looking for something that really fits your attributes. I mean, if you're, a player on a sports team, you want to play to your strengths. And if your strengths are in a particular area and the job you're in doesn't necessarily play to those strengths, that's probably not the best fit for you. At the same time, you may not have the luxury of being able to move. So look at some of the top performers and say, what is it they're doing really well? Hey, is that something I could do? What you might find out, Will, is that over time, when you start developing these new skills, it wasn't that you really didn't enjoy it, is that you didn't enjoy it because you weren't that good at it. So once you become more proficient, you may actually say, hey, this type of selling is more enjoyable than I thought because genuinely people like things they're good at. So they may, for some reason, make the assumption, well, I really don't have the skills to do this. But once they develop the skills, they may very much come to enjoy it.
And is that another trait then, that the A players really enjoy selling and really enjoy closing the deals? And to put it into context, I'm not saying that they enjoy every single minute and every request from a sales manager for some stupid report that doesn't mean anything to them, but of course means something to someone else. But on the whole, do they enjoy what they're doing?
I think they enjoy what they're doing, and I don't think it's just about closing. I think closing in a transactional sale, there's a huge amount of satisfaction. So if your sales cycle is either, within the hour, you've got someone on the phone, they're going to make a purchase decision or not, or it's a 1 week type of decision, then I think there's kind of this huge satisfaction with with closing the sale. In a much longer sales cycle, there has to be interim wins along the way. In other words, you mentioned you came from the medical device industry. You have to genuinely want to help people. So if you're in a much more consultative sale, what really should be driving you is excellence and the ability to help your customers solve complex problems. Ultimately, the scorecard is probably about winning or losing, but you really have to enjoy the process along the way and the project management you mentioned. Whereas in a more transactional sale, you can really just kind of savor the win.
And how does this fit in from the perspective of your sales manager? And where I want to go with this is that I've had some sales managers that have been excellent, really good managers. I've got on really well with them, and they have brought out the best in me. I've also had some atrocious sales managers who were, and I'm holding back from swearing because they were just complete idiots, and they really held me back. And one in particular made my life not miserable, because of course that you as a person are in control of whether you're happy or sad and all that. But he didn't help on many fronts. How important is it for the salesperson to fit in with the management in a company? And are there any traits of salespeople that make them easier to manage? Because I know that, and if any of my old managers ever listen to these shows, which I'm sure they probably do, the audience we've got now, all of them, even the ones I got on well with, I was a massive pain in the ass to manage. So going back to that question is, are there any traits in highly successful salespeople that make them better and easier to manage from a management perspective?
I'm sure there are. And I think that people who are more agreeable, more coachable, do not necessarily have huge egos are probably easier to manage. But I'd really turn that question around and really say, what are the traits of the great managers? Because a great manager should be able to manage a very diverse workforce and really understand what makes each person tick. If you think about top performers in a organization, in many cases, they're the most difficult people to manage, but you wouldn't want to lose them from your team. So we really think the onus is on the manager. There's an expression, people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses. And so, we have a book called The High Impact Sales Manager, and one of the areas we really talk about is 5 essential elements that make someone a great manager. And 2 of those attributes directly relate to, well, actually 3 of them directly relate to salespeople. One is making sure you're hiring the right people on attributes that will lead to success. Another one is providing personalized sales coaching. So sales coaching isn't one size fits all. You're working with each individual on areas for improvement that are relevant to them. And the third is being around great leaders. And what are the attributes of great leaders that make a manager really someone you enjoy working for, someone you're eager to follow, and someone that you respect. So while there are definitely some attributes that makes a salesperson easier to manage, the real issue is making sure there's an effective sales manager that can manage a diverse sales force.
And this will make the audience smile as well, because we've talked about this before in the past. Is it? And this is a leading question. I think you're going to go down this. I think you're going to answer this one way. Is it the manager's responsibility if the salesperson is being a pain? And I'll use me as an example. I always was in the top 10% of the sales force. I was never in that top 1%, and I appreciate that. I always worked hard enough to hit target and get a bit over and get the nice little chunk of bonus, but I never super excelled. And in hindsight, it was because I was putting in good hours and good work, but I could have put in more, being a single guy at the time as well and not having any responsibilities. Is this, from the perspective of the salesperson, is this my fault and my prerogative to improve and push that a little bit further? Or does the sales manager have some of the responsibility in this for not driving those actions?
I think there's a little bit of joint, responsibility on the part of the salesperson. It's really about, are there things you can do to really increase your own motivation? On the part of the sales manager is, if you've got a high performer, it sounds like you were a high performer, how can I help that person take their game to the next level? So we certainly want salespeople that are eager to, improve and we want managers who can kind of pull out the best of people. But the other thing I would say is if I was that manager, I would probably say you're hitting your numbers, you're putting in the hours. Yes, I'd like to get a little bit more from Will, but he's doing well. And I might, we think that managers are really busy. I mean, most sales managers that I know are working far more than 40 hours a week. They have to put together forecasts for their managers. They have to deal with customer issues, employee issues. So they have to allocate their time among their sales force pretty judiciously. And what I would say is, for a high performer like yourself, they should get some limited amount of time. The real skill for sales managers is how do they move the middle, and people who are kind of more in that average area. And if you just get, imagine you have a sales team, Will, of 8 people, and you got 2 bottom performers, 2 top performers, and 4 middle performers. You're going to get your most leverage first by working with the people in the middle, then the top, and then the bottom performers. And I think most managers get that wrong. They kind of go to the squeaky wheel based on the person that's craving the attention, as opposed to where they're going to get the best ROI.
And I'm going to dive into this for a second, then we'll come back to these traits. But how, or are there any ways that a salesperson can motivate themselves that perhaps a sales manager just physically can't? Are there any things that we should, as we're listening to this, be taking away from it to increase our own motivation rather than having to rely on, even if we have an exceptional sales manager, to having to rely on them?
Yeah, I think intrinsically a salesperson should always look at, year over year performance. They should look at their won-loss rates. They should look at their sales pipeline. Because I think there is an expression, I think there's truth to this. If you're not growing, you're actually moving backwards. So I think that each salesperson should probably take 3, kind of taking from the management playbook, but 3 KPIs for a salesperson. That could be overall size of the pipeline, could be velocity of the pipeline, it could be win rates, and start measuring themselves, because I think salespeople are inherently competitive. And if they can focus on 2 or 3 quick measurements, and then they say, okay, to have higher win rates, what would I need to do differently? To have a more robust pipeline, what would I need to do differently? So depending on, again, on the industry and what are the relevant metrics, I would encourage every salesperson to focus on 2 to 3 areas for improvement, not more than that. I think if you start to say, I'm going to get better at 10 things, you're going to dismiss it pretty quickly. But I think if you identify somewhere between 1 and 3 things where you can actually improve, and then you can, so I like to see everybody, not just salespeople. It could be customer service. It could be managers, have personal development plans.
And is that another trait of the highly successful salesperson, in that they twofold? One, measure things, because that's something that I've seen in people who are in the world of entrepreneurship as well, who are successful. I think it's Peter Drucker. I'm going to totally murder this. But essentially what gets measured gets moved, or something along those lines, a quote. Is it highly successful salespeople? 1, do they measure? And then 2, do they have plans? Is that another couple of traits?
So I think for sure they measure. And I think they're better off if they have plans. But whether those plans are documented or internalized is kind of secondary. We like documented because it's something you can refer to and actually provides another level of measurement. So I agree with you that what gets measured is something that's much more likely to change than if it's not being measured. In terms of, if someone is looking at sales as a profession, which is the way we look at it, we often use the term sales professional. If someone's a professional, they're always looking to get better. And so one of the attributes we like to look for in salespeople is salespeople who are naturally curious, who are looking for ways to improve.
And I've got 2 things I want to run over. One, and this is, I'm going to ask you, being the expert in sales management, and this is an intriguing question I've always wondered and never asked a guest before, I don't think. And that is, when a sales manager sits down in a interview and they're interviewing their salesperson, do they only, or no, put it in a different perspective, do they think that they've hired an A salesperson every single time, and then it's only 6 months down the line that they find out they've hired an A, B, C, or whatever salesperson? Do they come out of the interview process thinking that they've cracked it, or do they just hire C salespeople to fill seats?
I think they hire the best available salesperson. So I think that there's probably a pressure from upper management to fill a vacant position. They'd love to fill it with what they think is an A player, but if an A player wasn't available, at least some managers would hire a B, hopefully not a C player. I think the real issue is they think they hired an A player, and 6 months later, that person they think they hired was an A player isn't working out. And I think it's because most managers, or many managers, don't have good interviewing skills. They end up basically selling the position, asking leading questions, and they do 80% of the talking, where it's very much like selling. They should be doing about 20% of the talking and start before they begin the interview thinking about what's that job profile, what are the attributes I'm looking for, and how am I going to interview for those attributes and really discover the truth. Otherwise, they're likely to hire someone who's very charismatic, someone who's a professional interview, comes across as an A player, and 6 months later they have a performance problem.
Because the reason I ask is that in these conversations and when we're talking about A, B, C players, and I like talking about these terms because then the audience and myself as well can put ourselves. I think it's important to have perspective on your performance so you can put yourself in one of those categories and you know how and where you can improve. And clearly we're talking about the traits that perhaps some of the audience and myself want to pick up as well and work on. So that's the whole point of that. But it seems that there's a bell curve of C players, B players, and a minority of A's at the front. And it just strikes me as odd that every company, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems that every company has C, B, and A players. And so the C's have been hired at some point. And I'm always intrigued as how they managed to get in there.
I think that the reality is that there's a limited number of quote unquote A players. But I think because you're an A player in one organization doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an A player in another organization. You may or may not be. What you really need to think about is the conversation you and I were having much earlier, which are what are the key attributes that's going to be successful, make me successful in that organization. And I think a really good salesperson, when they're interviewing, they'll have choices. And so I think the question that a salesperson might want to ask in an interview is, tell me, when you look at your top 20%, what are the attributes that they possess? Because if you ask as the salesperson, what are the attributes that the top players possess, and you're not desperate to land a job, you may find that the job's not a good fit for you. If they say, well, our best people spend 80% of their time prospecting, and prospecting is not something you enjoy or are good at, then you don't want to take that position. So I think sometimes salespeople, in their eagerness to win and to win a job, end up taking a job that's not a great fit because they didn't really understand what drives success within that organization. And all of a sudden now they're out looking for a job 6 months later, which really looks bad on their resume. They held a position for 6 months.
Definitely. And that's a food for thought for any of the audience members who are job hunting at the moment. And final one on this before I ask you a few questions that I ask everyone that comes on the show. How much, and where I want to go with this is it hard work or is it working smarter that separates those A and B players? So assuming that we've got the traits and we're working somewhat hard, is it literally just the amount of hours that the A players work, that they put in, that I always saw myself not putting in, and perhaps I could have gone from that 10% to that 1 or 2%? Or is it that they are just so good at everything else that makes up more ground than the hours that's worked?
I think it's a combination of the two, but I don't think it's about hours. I think it's about productivity. And I think the best salespeople focus like a laser on things that are important and don't let themselves get distracted by things that aren't important. So if someone's putting in 60 hours a week as a sales professional, it may very well be that the job doesn't require that. It may not require 30, but it may require 40 or 45 hours a week. The question is one of productivity. And that's where it gets back to the point you were making about what gets measured. So if you really focus on what's important and you have metrics associated with your work, then you can really say, I'm highly productive. If you're falling short of those metrics, you can say, okay, what's really taking up my time that's not allowing me to be productive? And I do find that the key skill of great salespeople is they understand what's important, they focus on it like a laser, and they're highly productive during the course of the day. And this way they don't have to work obscene hours.
How do you deal with your sales manager asking for stupid reports and requests that is pulling you away from your laser focus on adding value and closing deals and building relationships?
I think you have to be careful there. You have to understand the nature of the request. It may not be that the sales manager even necessarily needs a report, but that may be coming down from a vice president or general manager, in which case your sales manager may be a little bit stuck. Certainly they can give a little bit of pushback. The other thing is if you're getting like ad hoc requests for different reports, like the report du jour, and you don't really know what's expected, you might say, hey, I really want to be responsive to your requests. maybe we could put together a list of the most important reports you need and the timing. And this way I can be timely in the submission and not have to generate so many reports. So maybe if there's 5 reports that are being asked for on a routine basis and it's 1 a week, that may not be so unreasonable. It reminds me of a story. Well, when I was early in my career, there was a great CEO, and I'm going to date myself a little bit, but we had, in addition to laptops, we didn't even have laptops. We had, the PCs were first coming out, but we had an AS400. And so we'd get these huge green bar reports. And he told the IT leader, every day produce one of the, put all the reports we produce and put it outside my office. Within the course of a week, he had a mountain of reports. He said, why don't you start producing one less every day and see if anyone notices? And so I think there is this report proliferation, particularly with CRM systems, that can happen because you could sort and report on anything. And so I think the salesperson can have a very, candid, respectful conversation. What's really important here? Because I need to give you what's important to do your job, but I also want to make sure that I'm using my time in our mutual best interest to generate as much business as possible.
Good stuff. Norman, I've got a couple of questions that I ask everyone that comes on the show. First one I'm going to throw at you. Who is the world's greatest salesperson?
World's greatest salesperson. I would probably go back, again, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but Zig Ziglar. I can remember early in my career listening to the Zig Ziglar tapes. In those days, we used cassette tapes and had a cassette player, and I had a long commute. I was commuting about 40 minutes to work. At those days, people didn't work virtually. Everybody went to the office. And I would listen, and I think there was just such good insights and such authenticity in the advice that he provided. So I'd probably say he was, in my view, the top salesperson.
I don't think you're dating yourself whatsoever. I think that there's a lot of nonsense, audio book-wise and even just book-wise, that is being thrown at us, and it's almost trendy at the moment for self-help and these kind of things that Zig Ziglar's work, perhaps some of it falls into alongside the sales side of things. And I would always recommend him because I think he's a real pioneer in all that and the mindset side of things. And I think most of the stuff that's come out since has just been a poor imitation. Would you agree with that?
I think there's some really good stuff that's come out. So I'm not going to categorize everything, in just one paintbrush. But I would say that way too much of the stuff that comes out is too long, too detailed, and way too theoretical. And so when I start seeing these, 300, 400 page books on sales and all these different chapters and too many different diagrams, and I'm a salesperson at heart, and I start looking at that and say, that's not relevant to me. I can't apply that. So I like quick, practical advice that people can apply, that makes sense, that's intuitive. And I think that sometimes there's this desire to get too involved with the esoteric and complex, and it's great when it works. But if you think about, I'm an American football fan. If you think about American football, when they use a trick play, it doesn't work very often. So we all applaud when some magical play happens. But selling is pretty straightforward, and so we like to keep it simple. We want to keep it applicable, and I would agree with you that a lot of the books that come out do not fit that bill.
And again, to hold on to this topic of traits of highly successful salespeople for one more minute, is this something that you see in them, in that they are reading books, they are using audiobooks on the way to work, they're listening to podcasts like this in the, perhaps the downtime at lunch, or whether it's on the way to a meeting to get informed and excited and motivated? Is that a trend that you see that splits the top performers away from the middle of the pack?
I think top performers are always interested in learning. And I think today, whether it's shows like yours, podcasts like yours, instructional videos, books that are in fact relevant, they are looking at those. But I think that there's so many different methods. I mean, with podcasts, video, white papers. And I think the temptation to get into deep books is really somewhat of a problem. Unless you are on flights and traveling a lot, what's likely to happen, or at least happens to me, is I end up starting a lot of books and not finishing. So I would probably figure out, again, to the core skills that a salesperson is trying to develop, and really go much deeper on those skills. So if someone needs to do a better job of presenting value to their customers, I would really, today with Google search, you can go pretty deep and find some really good information that's really spot on for what you're looking to learn.
And on that, another question I ask everyone, Norman, what is one book or resource other than your own, which we'll come on to in a second, that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
Again, I'll go back a little bit. Who Moved My Cheese is a great book, and I think it shows kind of that things are changing. And if you think about the sales world, it's changed so much in the last 10 years. Clients are no longer dependent on salespeople as their source of information. They can learn everything they want to know about you and your competitors and your products and your specifications online. So this idea that you now are this wealth of company and industry information is no longer that relevant to your client. And that's why I was emphasizing early in our conversation the idea of creating value and the issue of value is one of relevancy. Is it highly relevant to the person you're speaking with?
I love it. That is, along with The War of Art, is my most gifted book. Most of my family have had it. I'm looking over here because I've got a bookshelf with a bunch of books and I can't find it to pull it out, but it's full of notes and scribbles, and it's such a simple, I think you'd call it parables, the word to describe it. It's brilliant, and we'll link to that in the show notes for anyone who hasn't read it. It's super high on my recommended reading list for not just salespeople, but for anyone who is perhaps happy to be comfortable. I think that is the message that I got from Who Moved My Cheese, that being comfortable is paradoxically uncomfortable because there's always something coming around the corner. And with that final question, Norman, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I think the advice I would give is become a better listener. I think that there's a temptation, especially early in your career, to show how much you know. And it's not, again, it's this notion of applied intelligence. So you're not going to convince someone you're a subject matter expert by spewing at them facts and information. It may be impressive at first, but it's not going to last very long. And so I think more curiosity and more interest in learning other people's perspectives. And I think with maturity and training, the understanding that there's more than one way to approach a problem. And if you understand your client's perspective as opposed to just biasing everything with your own perspective, I would have been even more successful earlier in my career.
Amazing stuff. And with that, Norman, for everyone that is really intrigued to learn more about you and what you do, tell us a little bit about your new book and where we can find out more about you in general.
Okay, so let me start with our website. We're the Sales Readiness Group, and it's just the way you spell it. So you can go to salesreadinessgroup.com, and you can find out information about our book there and our training programs. But at a high level, our firm focuses on B2B selling, and both at a fundamental and advanced level. And we have lots of great free resources. If you go to the resources tabs, white papers, blog posts, etc. As it relates to the new book, I have a copy here on my desk. It's relatively short. It's called The High Impact Sales Manager. It's a book that's really a synopsis of our sales management training program. And for anyone in the audience who's a sales manager or an aspiring sales manager, it's a pretty quick read. You can find it on Amazon. HighImpactSalesManager.com is a separate website we've set up for the book. But what I like about the book and why we wrote it is it really zeroes in on 5 key skills that managers need to be really effective. And one of them is hiring the right people. Another is being able to manage a sales pipeline, being able to manage a sales team, to coach individuals, and to lead a team. So, we're really proud of this new book. It is again, a synopsis of our sales training program, and it's a quick read for anyone who's interested in becoming or already is a sales manager.
Fantastic. We'll link to all that in the show notes for anyone who is running on a treadmill, trying to scribble things on the back of their hand, or driving and trying to do the same at the moment, listening to the show. And with that, Norman, I want to thank you for your insights and your time today. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Will, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And there we have it. Thank you, Norman, for coming on the show. Thank you, Sales Nation, for tuning in. As always, I think I say this every episode. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy and your attention. And clearly, the show would not exist without you guys tuning in. If you haven't already, make sure you check out Nelson's show, which aired yesterday, all about memory, how to remember names, product information, a whole bunch more. That's available on iTunes, also on YouTube, and of course, salesman.red. And with that all said, I'll speak with you all again tomorrow.